So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Steve Portugal is a reader in animal behaviour and physiology at Royal Holloway College, University of London. He's a comparative ecophysiologist who studies how animals adapt their behaviour and ecology to the challenges of their environment. His research has focused on naked mole rats, Siamese fighting fish, and the role of vision in the propensity for certain bird species to fly into man-made objects. His main research, however, is bird flight and what happens when birds come together in flocks. Steve has published over 60 academic papers and acted as scientific advisor for numerous nature documentaries, including Springwatch, David Attenborough's Natural Curiosities, Conquest of the Skies, Life in the Air, and Nature's Boldest Thieves. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to hand you over to Steve for tonight's talk.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here this evening talking to you all. So very good evening, good morning, good night, or good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. It's really great to talk to you and to be able to share my research and a passion that I've had that really stems back to a very, very young age and a very small boy, where I grew up being basically obsessed with birds, and this led me to following a career path that enabled me to work with them on a quite a permanent basis. And one of my main interests in animals in general is what happens when they come together in a group. And we know that animals come together in groups in numerous ways. They come together and we see these amazing natural spectacles of these huge herds of animals, these huge swarms of insects, shoals of fish and flocks of birds. And I'm really interested in what's going on between individuals in those groups. Who is making the decisions? Sometimes you can watch a group of animals and suddenly one of them will stand up, walk off, and the others will just follow. How does that happen? How has that been communicated? And what makes that individual a leader? Other times you watch an animal stand up, wander off, and its friends look around, stare at it, carry on with what they're doing, with no interest at all in following them. So I'm really interested in what makes you a leader, for example. How do animals make decisions about where to go, when to go, who to go with? And we know that animals come together to live in groups for various reasons, and these reasons are many, many reasons, as you can see in these various videos that are currently playing here. For example, in the top left, we know that large swarms and shoals of fish come together. And what they're doing there is they're hoping for what we call a dilution effect. They're secretly hoping that if one of them is going to get taken by a predator, it won't be them. If there's enough of you, the chances of it being you are significantly reduced. We also know that when you have lots of animals together in a group, like you can see here with these bats coming out of their cave, or these fish trying to evade predation by these sharks, by having lots of individuals, you can cause a confusion effect. And that confusion effect makes it really hard for a predator to pick out an individual animal and take it out and basically eat it. You can also club together for defense. You've got a great little video here of an Arctic tern colony. Now, Arctic terns like to mob a predator. So as soon as there's an invasion of something that wants to cause their eggs or young harm, all the adults rise up and start to defend their territories and attack the intruder. And indeed, I've accidentally walked through an Arctic tern colony myself in the Shetlands. When they're on the ground, they're surprisingly camouflaged, and came out of it looking like something out of a horror movie, with literally blood pouring from my head, where I've been pecked by 1,000 tiny angry birds. We also know that animals come together in groups for warm reasons, to keep warm. Emperor penguins in Antarctica, those males that are incubating those eggs through the dark Antarctic winter, couldn't do it on their own. They need to be with others of their kind. And similarly, many birds in particular use living in a group to enable you to increase your vigilance. So these widgeons you've got down the bottom there, feeding on grass out of the water, they are sharing their vigilance to help each other out and reduce the individual vigilance. So we know that animals come together in groups for lots and lots of reasons. But the reason I'm particularly excited by studying birds is I'm interested in what happens to them when they get going, when they're on the move. So imagine that you're a herd of cows and you're in a field, and you'll want to make a decision about where to go, when to go, and who to go with as a group. Now you can stop, you can take your time, you can look at each other, and indeed this is what they do. You can exchange information, you can point in the direction you want to go at, but it's quite a relaxed process. You don't need to worry so much about high speed if you're not being predated upon. For birds, however, it's a very different story. It's an immensely dynamic system. And that's because once a bird is up there in the sky, flying maybe at 30, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour, they simply can't stop and hang in midair and have a little discussion about where to go and how to go about it. Once a bird stops moving forward, unless you're an expert like a kestrel or an osprey, you're going to stall and you're going to fall out the sky. So I'm really interested in what happens when birds come together in a group and when they start moving and they're supporting their own body weight up there in the sky. As I mentioned, if they stop flying forward, they will fall out the sky. This makes it a really exciting dynamic system. And I'm interested in what aerodynamic interactions take place between all those members of the group when they're up in the sky, traveling from A to B. And that A to B might be a short 5-minute journey, or it could be a 10,000 kilometer migration. Now, when birds come together in groups, they tend to form two types of flock shape. We have the sort of distinctive V formation that many of us will have seen, and they also have a cluster formation, this sort of at times amazing moving flock of birds which can number up to 10 million individuals in some places in the world. Now, interestingly, it seems to be how big you are that dictates whether you fly in a cluster or whether you fly in a V formation. And this sort of imaginary cutoff tends to fall somewhere around a black-headed gull or a golden plover size. So we're sort of talking this sort of size. Bigger than that, you fly in a V formation. Smaller than that, you fly in a cluster. And I'm going to start today by talking about birds and what happens to them when they're flying in a V formation. So what we can see here is some lovely footage of common cranes flying above Venice. And on the video beneath that, we've got some barnacle geese flying up the coast in France. And for any keen birders out there, you will know that barnacle geese flying up the coast in France in the summer means, in theory, some seriously lost barnacle geese. They should be much further north. And these are actually someone's pets that they've trained to fly with. Whilst these cranes look majestic as they fly above Venice, whilst geese are amazing at flying super fast, one thing they have in common is they are not very maneuverable. They have a turning circle akin to that of a jumbo jet. If they tried to fly in a nice moving cluster, it wouldn't go very well. There would be an awful lot of collisions. So it seems that by being larger and not having that maneuverability means that you fly in a V formation. So why do birds fly in a V formation? What is the point of it? Well, there's 4 main ideas that try to explain perhaps why birds might fly in a V formation. One of these I've already mentioned. It's all to do with this dilution effect. Sometimes we refer to it as the selfish herd theory. Basically, you hang out with your friends all the time, but then when there's a predator coming by, you push them towards the edge and hope it's not you that gets even, or gets eaten rather. We also know that birds in a V formation share navigation and knowledge. So often you have mum and dad at the front and their kin, their children, bringing up the rear, learning a migration route from them. We also know that there can be visual elements of why you might fly in a V formation. If you're in a big swarming cluster, it's quite hard to see the leader at the front. Whereas if you're in a nice structured V formation, you can keep a really good eye on who's at the front. Particularly helpful perhaps if you're a young bird and you're keeping an eye on mum and dad who know where they're going. But this other idea that's really persisted for centuries about why birds fly in a V formation is this idea that there's something going on between members of the group that means that they can save energy by flying together as a team in a V formation. Now, amazingly, this idea was first formally put in writing, it may well have been discussed before, by Pliny the Elder in AD 23. And he wrote, like fast galleys cleaving the air more easily than if they drove at it with a straight front. So he was already suggesting or alluding to the idea that that shape had some kind of benefit for these birds. Now, he was having these ideas at the same time that many others in Western Europe were sort of a little bit behind in their thinking. And indeed, that picture there is from the medieval sort of times. And it's when we thought that swallows, for example, spent the winter in the bottom of rivers because we didn't understand migration and the fact that actually they're sunning themselves in sub-Saharan Africa. And we thought, for example, that barnacle geese went and hid in rocky shore invertebrates despite the somewhat obvious size difference. So Pliny was ahead of his time. But why do we think that there is a benefit for birds to fly together in a V formation? And the reason this idea has persisted all comes down to these quite pretty pictures that you're seeing here. What you can see coming off these aeroplanes are what we call wingtip vortices. Sounds complicated, but all that's happening is, as an object, like an aeroplane or a bird or a bat or something you've thrown at someone, as that's moving through the air, it has to make space for itself to move through the air, and thus it pushes air out the way. Now, most of that air gets pushed down, but some of it gets pushed along and it comes off the tip of the wing. Now, when that happens, we call that a wingtip vortex. So I'm an object, which indeed I am. If I was being catapulted through the air, I would be making air push out the way. Most of it would go down beneath me. Some of it would come off my arms, which if I was pretending that they were wingtips. So what you can see here, particularly with this red picture here in the middle, is what these wingtip vortices look like. And it's actually this air that's being pushed down that dictates the gap, the time gap between aeroplanes landing and taking off at airports. If you go and sit at Heathrow, if a giant Airbus is taken off, the air it's pushed out the way is greater, it persists for longer, and there is a bigger time gap until the next plane takes off, because planes do not want to be getting involved in each other's downwash. That's how accidents happen. So what does a wingtip vortex look like? Well, NASA have kindly thrown, or flown rather, not thrown, a plane through some smoke plumes. Now, what you can see there is what happens to that smoke when the wingtip goes through it. You can see there's this swirling vortex of air. Now you have to imagine that that's actually happening constantly. We just can't see it normally. But you can see it for that snapshot in time as they move through the smoke plumes. So why were we interested in this wingtip vortex and what does it mean? Well, for decades, very clever physicists, mathematicians, engineers, and aerodynamicists, is a tricky word to say, spent an awful lot of time doing some very complicated maths because they wanted to work out if there's a benefit to flying in a V formation, where should the birds position themselves? Now, what you can see here is a very sort of simplistic diagram showing a goose flying with some strange lines coming off its wings. Obviously, they're not normally there. And the simple rule to keep in the back of your mind as we move through the talk is that any air that's coming off the back of the bird from the body is bad. It's downwash. And to position yourself behind it means that you too would get pushed down. So it's akin, if you like, to being in a swimming pool, trying to get to the surface and someone pushing your head down. They're not very pleasant. So immediately behind the bird, downwash, not good. Off to the side, where we have this wingtip vortex that's trickling off the wing where it's been pushed along there, we call that upwash, and upwash is good. We like upwash. The theory being, if you're another bird, you could pop yourself in this lovely stream of upwash and have a bit of a helping hand. Now, one of the problems here was that all these people that did these immensely clever sums, they were treating birds as aeroplanes. They were applying what's called fixed wing aerodynamics to birds which can flap their wings 7, 8, 9 times a second. And that doesn't include the hummingbirds, which of course flap their wings at an immeasurable rate per second. So there was still a lot of questions to be asked about V formation flight. Why do they fly in a V? What is actually going on between members in the group? Are they actually taking advantage of this upwash, this good air that comes off the wingtip? And that's the kind of thing I wanted to find out. This is a lovely video the Discovery Channel made. It just shows you a very sort of overview. Here's the upwash in red coming off the bird's wingtips. And if the others line themselves up nicely in that red bit, the upwash, the good air, they might have a little bit of an easier time. Before we sort of look at the sort of interesting natural history, sciencey side of things, why are we interested in this? Why would anyone want to pay me to research such things? The reason being that there are many airlines and many technological corporations and companies that truly want to mimic how birds fly in a V formation. And we call this biomimetics, otherwise known as stealing from nature. We can try and come up with a solution in a decade that nature's had 63 million years to work on the same problem. And what many airlines want to do, and it sounds insane, but it's a genuine, realistic, not a pie in the sky idea, is they want passenger planes to fly in V formation over long distances. And they want that for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, it will use less fuel. That, in theory, will be better for the environment. It also means that planes can travel further on the same amount of fuel, so it will reduce the number of stopovers that are required due to flight refueling. Now, it's worth noting that in the old days, when planes flew in a V formation in World War I and World War II, they weren't flying in a V formation for any reason to do with aerodynamics. They were flying in V formation because the person at the front was in charge and they basically had to be able to see them. But also, they would be opening fire. So if you were flying in a cluster or in a straight line, wouldn't go very well. So at this point in those days, they weren't flying in a V for aerodynamic reasons. Now, this video was actually made relatively recently by a company who want to engage and invest in this idea of having planes flying in V formation. And what they want, what they desire, is this idea that a plane would take off, for example, from Brisbane in Australia. Another plane would take off from Sydney in Australia, Melbourne, Cairns, Canberra, Perth. And these planes would meet up over the east coast of Australia, get into the V formation, and then fly across the Pacific to the United States. And the idea being they would mimic what birds do, use this upwash to save fuel, better for the environment, and to be able to go for longer. And then when these planes get over to the United States and they're starting to see the coast, they would start to peel off to their respective airports, be that Seattle or Chicago, or indeed New York, as that one's showing there. So we have a question, which is, what's happening when birds are flying in a V formation? What aerodynamic interactions are taking place? I want to find out because I'm fundamentally fascinated by biology and natural history. Other people are interested because it has some direct technological applications. Up until recently, what was stopping us from being able to find out about what's going on up there in the sky when birds are flying in a formation is the technology. We simply had no way of measuring what was going on up there, sometimes kilometers away in the sky. Thankfully, around the early 80s, some very clever scientists started to develop what we call biologgers. Now, biologgers are little devices that we basically use to spy on animals when we can't actually see what they're doing or be where they are. And these loggers can record an amazing number of things. They can, for example, record pressure, and they can tell you how deep an animal's diving or how high an animal's flying. We can put cameras on them. We use GPS, much like many of us use in our cars and on our phones, so we can see where animals are. More recently, we use these things called accelerometers. Accelerometers measure what the animal is doing 300 times a second. So what that means is you can literally record every minute movement that an animal does. And when you couple that with GPS, you know where it was doing it. Now in the 80s, these loggers literally were the size of a car battery. They were just about okay for an elephant, maybe a whale shark or a blue whale. But if you put one on a bird, that bird wouldn't be going very far. Now, thankfully, like most technology, it's got smaller and smaller and smaller, and critically, cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So now we have this wonderful biologging technology that would tell us where a bird was in a V formation via the GPS. And then from the accelerometry loggers, I would know what that bird was doing when it was in that position. Because handedly, if you haven't noticed already, and I hadn't until I started doing this work many years ago, when a bird flaps its wings and the wings going up, down, up, down, up, down, unsurprisingly, in hindsight, the body also does the same thing. And by having these little accelerometers on their backs, I know every single wing flap they took. And I also know how big that wing flap was. So I can literally recreate weeks and weeks and weeks of V-formation flight by having these amazing loggers. But the last thing that's missing before I could complete this question and investigate it properly was I had no birds to work with. Because as amazing as these loggers are, I need to get them back off the animal to download my data. So you can imagine that if I just went down to my local park and put my loggers on some Canada geese that are pottering around, I could watch those geese fly off into the sunset, and the chances of me seeing my loggers again, which are incredibly expensive, and my data is fairly minimal. I needed some birds who were flying naturally, up in the sky as a group, but critically at the end of that, they'd come back down, come back to me, so I could take my loggers off and see what was going on. Now that opportunity presented itself, thankfully, when this bird came into my life. Now this is a Northern Bald Ibis, or wall-drop ibis, as it's known in Germany and Austria. And this is probably one of the best photos you will ever see of a Northern Bald Ibis, because many people, myself not included, consider them to be rather ugly and unattractive. Whereas I happen to think that amazing red and the contrast with the black is quite dynamic. And this black you see on their heads, on the bald bit, is actually different for every individual. So you can see who's who just from that wonderful head patch. But unfortunately for these birds, this photo was taken because they were listed a few years ago in the National Geographic as in the top 10 species likely to go extinct in the wild in the future. So historically, this bird covered a huge area: Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, even down into Central Africa. But by around the 1800s, they were virtually extinct everywhere. Unfortunately for them, part of the contribution to why they became extinct in most of Europe is, and I don't like to judge species, but of all the animals I've worked with professionally, all the animals I've kept as pets, mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, insects, maybe not insects, but they are one of the stupidest species I've ever worked with, alas. It's not surprising they struggle in the modern world. That doesn't mean, however, that they should be allowed to go extinct. Now, there's only one population of these birds left in the wild now, which can be found in the mountains of Morocco. Up until 2013, there was one other population that existed in Syria, but unfortunately, they were taken out during the treacherous civil unrest there, which has caused so much harm to the people there. Along with that, unfortunately, was the extinction of the Syrian population of these birds. That was quite significant because the Syrian birds were the last migratory population of their kind. The ones that live in Morocco are a bit unusual. They don't migrate. Over in Austria, there's a wonderful charity called the Wall-Drop Team, so Wall-Drop being the German-Austrian name for them. And they are working very hard to reintroduce this bird into its former range in Europe. And this former range involves breeding in Austria, South Germany, and Switzerland, and migrating and wintering in southern Italy and northern Africa. Now, they were able to understand where these birds were found historically, quite amazingly, by looking at the old books that came with these fancy stately homes. Now, these stately homes, the people in charge, they wanted to know exactly what animals had been shot or trapped and were being brought into the kitchen for cooking to make sure that no one was stealing anything. And we could look at these various books to understand where these birds were historically and also what time of year they were there, which is quite amazing. But the question you might be thinking is, how do you reintroduce a bird where there's no adults left in the range that they were in Europe, and a bird that migrates? How do you teach a bird to migrate? And this is where this project came in to save me in terms of being able to work with birds. This project is reintroducing the ibis by getting human foster parents. The chicks hatch from the eggs come from a zoo collection, and the very first thing that those chicks see in the world as they hatch from the egg is a human foster parent. And what these birds do is they do what's called imprinting. And what they do is they look at the first thing they see, and if they spend the critical period, the first 24 hours of their life with these birds, with the foster parents, they think they're their parents and they imprint on them. Now, these human foster parents do an amazing job. Once they're attached to these birds, once they've hatched, they are with them for every moment that the birds are awake for 9 months. So they smell, basically. Now you can see just how imprinted these birds are. So this is Marcus down here in the bottom left in the yellow t-shirt. And these birds, for all intents and purposes, truly believe that Marcus is their parent. And they will follow Marcus everywhere. Now, when they're young and they can't fly yet, that means pottering around on the ground with Marcus, going for walks, for exercise, a bit like we're all doing. But what happens when you need to teach them to migrate? That's where the fun bit comes in. When the birds need to migrate, or when they're getting ready for migration, the foster parents are put in a microlight, sent up into the sky, and the birds, of course, think, oh, goodness, where are my parents going? Come back, don't leave me. And they start flying and follow the human foster parent in that microlight. And you can see these young birds, they've got the little white caps on their heads. They haven't got the naked bit yet with their distinctive black pattern. Now, in the back of that microlight, there's a young lady called Danielle. And Danielle spends about 3 months training her birds and printed onto her how to fly to get ready for migration. Now, as she flies over this little village, which is near Salzburg, she has a megaphone so all the birds can hear her. And she's calling what's short for Waldrop in Austrian, which is Wally. And I always love the fact that this whole village that quite happily in Austria spend 3 months of the year getting shouted at and called Wally. But you can see just how much those birds follow her. They will follow her everywhere. And that includes going up in the sky. Now, I don't know if any of you at home, wherever you may be, have ever been in a microlight. I have. It's not something I shall be doing again. It really felt like you were just sat in a chair with a hairdryer and a parachute above you. But it wasn't for me, shall we say, not to put you off trying it if the opportunity presents itself. But 2 things it really showed me. First, how noisy it is up there. The way the wind is howling, I don't know how the birds can communicate. And secondly, it's really cold. It's amazing the temperature drop as you start going up higher. So these young birds, they follow Danielle. They think, what are you doing to me, Mum? You're taking me to all these strange places. And then they get into great condition, and then it's time to actually migrate, to get them on the move. And what we did is we taught them a historic route from Germany, or the border with Austria, through Slovenia, and down into Italy. Now, we only avoid the Alps because the microlight can't cope with it. The birds are fine with it. It's us that are a bit feeble. We can't deal with the Alps. So we teach them this route. It gives them an idea of where they should be going. But when they fly back, they sensibly take a shortcut and hop over the mountains. They're not that stupid, it turns out. And what we do is we fly them every other day to give them a rest. And we undergo basically a migration. And when they're actually migrating, they're taught to fly off to the side of the microlight, which is good for me. It means there's no crazy microlight at the front ruining the aerodynamics. But what this meant was I had birds who were really truly free flying, who were actually undergoing a migration, and I could put my loggers on them. Because at the end of the day, these birds came back down and literally ran to their foster parents for hugs. So while they were having their lovely, look what I just did, mum, aren't I amazing, be proud of me, hugs, I could take my loggers off and download that data. So what did I find? Well, firstly, I found that they certainly have a favourite position they like to be in within this V formation. So what you're looking at on the top right, hopefully it shows the same on your screen, it's not inverted, you can see a heat plot. And what this heat plot is showing you is you have a bird at the front there, and then another bird behind it. And the more red the colour is, the more times we recorded a bird in that position. So you can see that over many, many days of flights, many, many hours, they had a position they really liked to be in. And we called this their V favoured position, because we didn't know what else to call it, to be honest. And you can see that that position is roughly about 1.5 meters out and about 1.5 meters back. And they spend most of their time locked in to that position. So clearly, this is not by chance. Something's going on here. But the puzzling bit was, when we ran the numbers through some very complicated equations that gave us brain ache for quite some time, we found that what they were doing fitted fixed wing aerodynamic theory, which is very confusing. Why that's the case will become clear in a couple of slides' time. What you can see here is what sort of shape they actually flew in. So this sort of Hawaiian-looking atoll colour up the top left is actually a heat plot of all of the flights combined. So rather than a V, they're sort of flying a bit of a boomerang shape. Now the figures that are on the right there, those little shaded areas behind each one are the same figure in the top left. It's the whole flight, the whole shape. And then each little one reflects where each individual bird within the group spent most of its time within that V formation. And we were very surprised. If the purpose of flying in a V formation is to save energy, why were some of them moving around so much? Some had a really clear left-hand preference, some had a really clear right-hand preference, and some just flew around like maniacs the entire time. One thing that we found that was really interesting is that what seemed to dictate where birds were was all to do with their social networks, their friends. So for example, one day we were flying them, and one of the young males called Merlin, he was flying along and just decided, I've had enough, I'm going down. And he tucked his wings in and bombed down and went down to a tree. And it's quite a long way down. And we could actually see the other members of the group turn their heads, look down and go, didn't really like him much anyway. And they just carried on. They were quite happy to let that bird be left behind. They did not care. Now, a few days later, Archimedes, another one of the birds, a number of them did this. The same thing happened. I'm tired, I'm having a rest, I'm going down. All the other birds looked around and said, oh, well, we like him, and they followed him all down. So it seems like it's very important to have connections and friends, because when we did some follow-up studies using a social network analysis on the ground, we found that those individuals that were followed had far more connections. They spent far more time with the other birds interacting with them than those poor individuals like Merlin, who no one really wanted to be friends with. So it's quite sad, really. But obviously he had his foster mum and dad, so it was okay in the end. So I mentioned that it was really surprising that these birds were flying in a position that matched fixed wing aerodynamic theory. It made no sense. Now, I'm going to explain something which took months for me to get my head around and figure out. So if after me talking to you for a couple of minutes about it on these slides, you don't understand, please don't be despondent. It literally took me months to get my head around this. So I'm going to try and explain it briefly. And I'm going to try starting with an analogy. So imagine back to when you were a kid and there was a heavy snowfall outside and you're only, tiny, tiny little child. Heavy snowfall is actually quite heavy going for you. Now, your mum or your dad or both may have gone out in advance and they've walked around the garden. And as they've walked around the garden, they've crunched down on the snow They've got much bigger feet than you when you're a child. So what they've done inadvertently is they've left a pathway through something complex and potentially hard that you can follow. You can follow their footsteps, you can put your feet in their footsteps, and you can literally follow where they went. And you have a much easier time of it than the person that first went through the snow. So your parents have left a little trail of kindness, helpfulness for you to follow. Now it turns out this is exactly what the birds are doing. What they're doing is a very complicated name. It's called spatial phasing of wing beats, creating wingtip path coherence. Now, obviously, certain fields of science love these fancy terms, but what it means in reality is, if I'm a bird and I'm leading the V formation, I'm flying along, my wing beat or my wingtip starts here or here, hopefully you can see, and as I flap, it goes down like that and back up to here. And we call that one whole wing beat, one whole wavelength. So I'm the lead bird, and I flapped like this at this point. What I've done with my upwash, the good air, coming off my wingtip, is I've left a path of helpfulness through the air that another bird could follow. Now, if you were to run around your living room flapping like a bird, what you would discover is, unsurprisingly, the air coming off your wingtip or your fingertips follows the same path through the air as your wingtip did. So as you flap like this, the upwash behind you is doing exactly the same thing. So what it turns out birds are doing, quite amazingly, when you think how dynamic the environment is up there, is they are taking advantage of this by making sure their wingtip follows the path through the sky of the bird in front, so that its wingtip is in that good upwash. So it's not a passive process. They don't just sit there and think, fingers crossed, hope for the best. They are actively tracking that upwash, that positive good air that will make their life easier. So another way to think of it is if I said to one of you, here's a spray can, the kind of thing you may or may not go graffitiing with, and I said, spray it, run as fast as you can, flapping your wings like a maniac, pretending you're a bird. I'm sure that's something we all do on a Sunday. And then I said to someone else, using your little finger, run behind that person or run at the V favored position and make sure your finger stays in the color that's been left behind by that spray can in the hand of the person in front. It's incredibly hard to do. So that's what these birds are doing. They are leaving a path of helpfulness in the sky from their wingtip for the bird behind to follow with its wingtip to have an easier time of flying. So there's super cooperative aerodynamics. Now this slightly cartoonesque cartoon will hopefully visualize it a little bit. So that yellow is the upwash coming off the wingtip, and you can see it's going like this through the sky as it follows the path of the wingtip. And therefore, when a bird is trying to follow it, it needs to match its wing beats so that the wingtip does the same thing in the same place. So it's incredibly, incredibly amazing what they do. And we don't understand the sensory ecology behind it. So how they sense it, I don't yet know. All the experiments I've tried to find out have failed spectacularly in a really quite impressive way. Now, interestingly, they really are cooperative. They take their turn. Being at the front, you get no benefit. Being at the back, great time, benefits to be had galore. But what they do is they take their turn. They make sure that those benefits are shared out between all the group members. Now, those figures, don't worry about them too much, but what they're telling you is that the longer you spend at the front at a certain time period, maybe one flight or even one day, the longer your flockmates will let you sit at the back the following flight. So basically they remember. They go, oh, hey, Archimedes, you did an awfully good job on Tuesday. You were at the front for ages. You worked super hard. We all benefited. So on Thursday, you go to the back. Don't worry about it. You're covered. So they take it in turns. They remember. which is quite impressive. Direct reciprocity is the official name we give that. Now, the other thing that was really fascinating was that it was assumed that birds learnt how to fly in a V formation from their parents. So you can imagine the scenario where you're a young bird, you're up in the sky, and you're getting it a bit wrong, and your dad and your mum are going, no, no, you don't go there. No, you don't. Oh, useless. You can just see that as a scenario. And we actually thought that was the case. And we thought, how are the birds going to fly in a V formation? Us human foster parents in a chair in the sky with a hairdryer on the back, we can't teach them that. But quite amazingly, they taught themselves. So what you can see here in the top left is a little plot from a prior study. And it shows you that adults flew in a V formation most of the time. And as juveniles got older, they started to fly in formation more. And as I say, we thought they were learning from the adults. What you can see with the other plots, B and C are heat plots, which show you the flights early on when they were in training. And you can definitely say there's not a V to be had there. They are an incoherent clustering blob. And then suddenly, around flight 7 to 9, as you can see in panel D there in the figure, something starts to emerge akin to a V formation. And then suddenly, by about flight 15, 16, these birds were flying in a perfect V formation. So there's obviously some feedback which taught them how to fly in a V formation. And that really surprised us. We thought they probably would struggle to get the hang of it. So how close are we at the moment to getting planes to fly like this? Not very. You're looking here at an expensive program, and expensive due to the insurance costs, where they actually try to fly close enough to each other to take advantage of upwash. Now they're trying to fly in a straight fashion. You can see, there we are, it's not going very well. And it turns out that us humans don't have the ability to fly close enough to planes and get the upwash. It gets dangerous. The only way we're going to do it is through computers, and that's what's currently being investigated. Now, that's V formation, and I'm very briefly, because I'm conscious of the time, I'm going to finish with a few slides that talk a little bit about cluster flocking, which is quite a tricky thing to say. Now, cluster flocking is what you see with these amazing murmurations, for example. These starling murmurations you see over Aberystwyth Pier, like it's been on Winter Watch recently, in Rome particularly, Ham Wall, Somerset levels, millions of birds seemingly moving as one sort of entity. And this video at the top here was a fantastic video that went viral. These two girls were kayaking, and then suddenly this huge murmuration of birds came over them. And they actually thought, and if you listen to the audio on that on YouTube, I think they thought the world was caving in, or Armageddon had come. But no, it was just this amazing murmuration. And these really capture our imagination, because how do they do that? How are they not colliding with each other? How are they talking to each other in a hundredth of a second to make these decisions? It's quite mind-blowing. And cluster flocks are interesting because they present a very different scenario to V formation. So when I work with the clusters, I work with pigeons, because pigeons are the largest bird that fly in a cluster. And we know that pigeons are good at carrying weight, at carrying additional things. For example, historically, when things were a bit frosty between the USA and Cuba, people used to train pigeons with Cuban cigars to fly from Cuba to Florida. So people would be sat on the beach sunning themselves in Florida, and a pigeon would plop down beside them with a cigar strapped to it. They've also been used, unfortunately, for drug trafficking, but we've also used them, they've got numerous medals from the World Wars. And you can see here, we used them for reconnaissance missions with these cameras you can hardly see, but they saved thousands of lives for the messages that they shared between trapped soldiers and Allied forces. So they had a huge role to play in the war. What that meant is I know that pigeons can take biologgers on their backs and they would cope with them okay. Now, don't worry about this figure because it's a bit complex, and I realise it's quite late in the evening now. But the take-home message you need to remember from that figure is, for birds flying in a cluster, flying at the back of the flock is bad. And it's also bad when other individuals get too close to you. So flying at the back is bad, different to a V formation, or flying close to each other is also bad. And that's because you suddenly have to start making all these adjustments to how you're flying so you don't collide with other individuals. And it suddenly becomes super hard work. Now, the study that found this, it's not one by myself. Here's an animation of some pigeons. Obviously not actual pigeons, but the data is from pigeons. And what you will notice is what this study did, it was a wonderful study. However, it only looked at pigeons flying in circles over their home loft. And in a second, you see now these two trailblazers are joined by the rest of their flock who finally decide to get off the floor and go for a fly. So flying in a circle is not particularly sort of realistic for normal birdie life. They're normally flying in straight lines. So I wanted to know what would happen if I flew pigeons over long distances with regards to their flocking. Now, I won't go into detail about how pigeons navigate, but obviously working with a homing pigeon that will come home makes life tremendously easy. And we know that pigeons, for example, use landmarks, the magnetic field, they have an inbuilt compass, they use the sun, they also have amazing smell, and we think they can also hear infrasound. And they use all of this to make sure they come home in one piece. I was interested to know what happens in a cluster flock over a long flight. Is it dynamic? Do they take turns? How different is it to a V formation? And to do that, we fly them hundreds and hundreds of times. What you're looking at on the bottom left here is their home loft, and the top right is where they were released from. And you can see the yellow line is a flight where they've been flying many, many, many times. And you can see how it's quite straight, whereas the other two flights were early onset flights when they were learning. And pigeons get better and better and better up until about 15 flights, where their flight route becomes really straight. After that, they tend to fly the same route. So I wanted to know, do pigeons take it in turns? We know from the prior study that flying at the back of a pigeon flock is bad. You're working hard because all the other pigeons are moving around you. What we found was quite shocking. What you can see here is a pigeon. Beneath it is a heat plot again, showing you the shape of the flock when they're flying. Now onto the right, with panels C and D, you can see again the shaded area behind them is the overall flock shape. And you can see flights for two individuals there. And what you'll notice is that that individual at the top there in panel C is always in the front 50% of that flock, whereas that poor individual in panel D is always at the back of that flock. Now we flew them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and those individuals that are always in the front are always in the front, and those individuals at the back are always in the back. So those poor individuals at the back are always having a tough, rougher time. They're always working harder. And they probably only put up with it because it's still safer than being on their own. And to finish with, I want to show you a study that I've just recently done that I basically just found quite amusing. So I took my birds, and at this point, they'd only ever been flown in a group. Same birds in the front 50%, same poor birds in the back 50%. And then I released them for the first time ever on their own from this release site they had flown as a group from over, I think by that point, well over 200 times. What you can see on the left in panel A, in the red, is the routes that the pigeons in the front 50% of the flock took to come home. Now they took the same route they took as a group, and they came home in about 11 to 12 minutes, no problem. Now what you're looking at on the right in panels B to G in the blue are those pigeons who made up the back 50% of the flock and were always in that back 50% of the flock. And you can see that quite evidently they had not learnt the route at all. In fact, some of them were absolutely useless. Some of them didn't come home for over a week. What you can see here where the trace ends is the logger battery finishing. The logger batteries last at least 24 hours. So you can see that some of these poor pigeons in the back 50% really didn't get very far at all. Some of them flew around for hours, others just sat there. What's going on? Well, I needed to repeat this. I only had an N of 1, a sample of 1. So I took them to a new site. I released them hundreds of times as a group. And that group flight you can see here in black. And I did the same thing. I found that the same pigeons are always in the front, having a great time. And those same poor pigeons are always in the back, having a pretty rough time. And sure enough, when I released them for the first time on their own from this new release site, those pigeons at the front came back no problem in the red there in the traces, whereas the pigeons in the back had got even worse. As you can see from the traces, one of them only flew for a matter of minutes before giving up and sitting in a tree for at least 24 hours. Another one flew non-stop for hours and hours and hours. One can assume frantically looking for a flock mate. Others even ganged up. I released them an hour between each other. But you can see from H and K down there that two of these pigeons actually met up for a while. They flew together for a bit, realised that neither of them had a clue what they were doing or where they were, blind leading the blind, and they separated. So clearly this is some form of passenger effect. We've all been there. You've been the passenger in the car. The driver said to you, did I go left or right back there? And you go, I'm so sorry, I've got no idea. I wasn't paying any attention. And it looks like these back pigeons are doing exactly the same thing. And to finish on, the reason we think that these pigeons are not so good at finding their way home and end up in the back where it's bad, the complete opposite to a V formation. V formations cooperate, take it in turns, not in pigeons. If you're in a good spot, you stay there. If you're in a bad spot, you're stuck there. It looks like it's an element of personality which determines whether you're a leading front 50% pigeon or a following back 50% pigeon. Now what this map shows you, the square is actually my house and the triangle is my university pigeon loft. And this was the first ever release from this period, or from this place at the time. And also it was only their third ever release. These were very young birds. You can see there in the red, blue and green that those three individuals came back pretty amazingly quick. Only flown properly 3 times in their life, been released, and never been released from my house before. Whereas yellow, brown and black had a rather different experience. Brown actually rather was happily going to Thorpe Park, down there in the bottom right, exploring the roller coasters. The yellow individual flew around in circles for hours and ended up on the roof of the Chinese in Egham, while the black bird, in the line here, took some way of a convoluted route, but eventually came home within 24 hours, unlike the yellow and the brown one. And it seems like we can predict that, so if you're into pigeon racing and betting, by their personality. What these graphs are showing you, and the take-home message really is, if a bird is willing to explore in a novel environment, in a new arena, with nothing they've ever experienced before, they will be more willing to explore when they're released, and they become better homers. If they are individuals who are scared of new arenas, who are scared of objects they've not seen before, when we first release them, they don't explore, they're too scared, they go back in their loft. And then when we start to release them from further afield, they get lost. And when we release them as a group, they're always at the back. So V formation, positive, you take it in turns, you all benefit. There's some great cooperative aerodynamics going on there. You're helping each other out. Pigeons, complete opposite. Being at the back is terrible. Being at the front is good. You don't change, it's not cooperative. And it looks like what dictates where you sit in that is your personality. If you're scared, basically, if you're not willing to explore, you will end up at the back of the flock where you'll have a much tougher time and also be unlikely to learn the routes. Now, of course, all this work involves a multitude of people who I won't go through and thank individually because I realise it's 7:30 already, but just to thank all those many, many, many people involved in these huge projects that have taken quite a few years. And lastly, to thank you all very much indeed for listening. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Steve. That was a really fascinating talk. I could see a lot of things going through in the chat where people have decided whether they're front pigeons or back pigeons. Quite but those are really very informative and interesting studies, and it is also it's very interesting to see the difference between those two kinds of ways of operating. I found that particularly interesting. We are running out of time, but we are going to try and just do a couple of questions from the chat, if that's okay. And I understand some people need to leave, and that's fine. You can also catch up with that on the, catch up with our video. But David, are there a couple of things that you could pick out from the chat? I know it was very busy.
Yeah. It was very busy. We'll not cover everything, but I thought there was a bunch of questions around for the birds flying in the V formation. How do they know where? Because there isn't actually like a yellow stream coming off the wing to align with. How do they know where to put themselves?
Yes, that is a great question, which has been giving me sleepless nights since 2014, really. So we think there's a combination of three things going on. Firstly, birds have these special feathers called phyllo plumes. And these phyllo plume feathers are distributed around their bodies and across their wings. And it's thought that they sense pressure or pressure changes. And it's thought that they use these special feathers to sense the airflow to then position themselves in that spot. And we tried many ways to test this. We covered the phyllo plumes in Vaseline, for example, to see if it meant they couldn't sense it, but the birds refused to fly. We tried covering them in a bit of tin foil, but the birds refused to fly. So we got to the point where, of course, these are critically endangered birds being reintroduced when we really couldn't tamper with them anymore. But it's possible it's these special feathers coupled with a positive feedback loop. Simply a case of, I'm moving myself around, oh, it was easier there, I will do this in this position. But the honest answer is, we don't really know, is the conclusion there.
Excellent. That's always a good scientific answer. It would be really boring if the answer was to everything that you knew it. You wouldn't have a job. So there was quite a lot of discussion as well about well, quite a lot of concern. Did all the pigeons get home? I think people really want to know that. Did they all make it back?
They did. I think the record was 18 days. And in fact, just recently, when I was permitted to, I had to drive from Surrey to North Yorkshire to get to one of my pigeons who had got awfully lost. Disappeared in November, popped up in someone else's loft in January. So they do certainly always get home, but sometimes it's assisted by humankind or takes some time. But yes, all the pigeons in that study, they did all come back eventually, loggers in tow, but they were in trouble, some of them. They took too long. They're sort of very naughty pigeons. So, but they all came back. Yes, I didn't lose any that time.
I think that's reassuring for people, because I think there was certainly a level of concern coming through in the chat about some of them. David, we may have got time for just one last question before we finish.
Yeah, I'll put one that I'm sort of pulling together from various comments on the group one. Nobody's quite asked this, but they're all bits. Is there some reason why the birds continue to have, it sounds like being a bird at the back's a bad thing to be, because you're rubbish at finding your way and you have rubbish at flying because you get buffeted about and so on. So why are those birds not being, driven out of, evolved out of existence? Why are they still being produced?
Yes, it's an excellent question. Part of that is all to do with also the differences between the sexes. So sometimes it's males and females in the front, males and females at the back. And I think that the thing is, if you sort of just had front birds, not only would you probably start to mess up your male to female ratios, but also there'd be less of you. So you would stand more chance of being that individual being picked off if there was a goshawk attacking from below or a peregrine attacking from above. So those birds are willing to tolerate the parasites who kind of don't know what they're doing, because if there's a predation event, again, you've got those more individuals and you're secretly hoping that it's them that are going to get picked. And interestingly, a lot of studies have shown that it is birds at the back who tend to get taken. So that could be why they're willing to tolerate them. They're all secretly hoping it's them that's going to get eaten, basically. So unfortunately, whenever we look at animals being social, most of the time they're just parasitizing each other. The other one gets eaten rather than them. So not always, but in many of the cases.
A cheery note to end on. Being sociable is just parasitism.
Yeah, and there's generally a lot of sympathy for the back pigeons. It's obviously a tough life. Okay, so I'm afraid we do have to end it there. I'm sure we could carry on, but we're going to kind of draw things to a close. Thank you again for a really fascinating, excellent talk, Steve. And thank you to everyone else for coming and taking part, for everybody joining in with the chat. We've had a lot of really very interesting questions. Our next LNHS talk will be on Thursday, the 18th of February, and that will be Joe Pecorelli, who will be giving a talk about the monitoring of river flies. So again, different subject, but again, I think that will be really fascinating. I don't know whether you would mind, Steve, is there any chance of people getting in touch with you if they've still got outstanding questions by maybe giving your email or something? It's entirely up to you though, so there's no pressure. But if you're happy to do that, if you wanted to just pop it in the chat, that would be great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you ever so much. Please see our website for details of all the forthcoming talks and to sign up to the mailing list. Do think about becoming an LNHS member if you're not already, and we do hope to see you all again very soon. Do stay safe, everyone, in the meantime, and look after yourselves. You can unmute yourselves if you'd like to say goodbye, and we always love it when people do that, so please do feel free. Thank you ever so much for coming. Take care.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We've got lots of very positive comments, Steve, in the chat. People really enjoying the talk and felt they got a lot from it, and that you explain things really well. People are saying, I understood it. So
Yes, it's always a case of picking the best bits to try and share and explain, and also within the time frame. Now, fortunately, I could talk for hours, indeed days. I got carried away and enough caffeine. Yes, it's a case of distilling the best bits. So I'm glad if it was accessible. That's reassuring.
Yeah, it was great. It was really fascinating. Such interesting work. And it worked out really well. The kind of combination of that reintroduction program with you being able to do, kind of study some the scientific aspects. That was kind of really fortunate that those things coincided. How is how is that project going in terms of the reintroduction? Is it kind of successful, or is it hard to say?
It was going very successfully, and then unfortunately, this is factually correct. Basically, Italian hunters shot them all, and the Italian official shooting Italian association agreed they wouldn't shoot ibis, but one year they took out all of them and claimed they thought they were crows. And they didn't realize it was an ibis. So they actually had to pause it for 2 years until better measures were put in place to protect them in Italy. But it was heartbreaking because each bird was worth thousands, if not tens of thousands of pounds. In multiple countries, they got school children involved to name them and follow them with an app. Jane Goodall released one. That one got shot. So it was terrible. It was quite
very sad.
fun.
Yeah.
Having to tell school kids that their ibis they lovingly followed got shot. So it took a couple of years to sort it out, but things have got better, and it has started to succeed. And the first proper adults have come back to Salzburg and the surrounding area on their own to breed.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, I was wondering how they were coping with that migration. So so I mean, it is a shame that some people don't necessarily kind of, I don't know, take a different stance on things, but it's kind of good that seems to be now moving forward again.
When was the year that they got shot? When did that happen?
So the shooting really, well, it was the whole time, but in slightly sort of smaller numbers, but it really took off in sort of a lot between 2015 and 2017 was when it really became a problem where there was no point in carrying on if that wasn't solved. And that's the year they took off. They didn't release any for a year. And of course, last year was tricky because of all that was going on in the world. But all being well, they will carry on this year, fingers crossed, because it's a huge operation. It involves numerous, large trucks that people live in, large truck the birds live in for traveling, and then the aviary you build each time that you get to a site, all the microlights, all the welfare staff, all the volunteers, the cooks, everything. It involves nearly 100 people. So it's big scale work. Yeah.
Thank you. So there, fingers crossed that the long-term outcome will be better. Okay, so we're going to carry on just saying goodbye to people now. But thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you. It was an amazing talk. Really.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Maria, is it possible to have like an output of the comments, because some of the questions can be quite sort of inspiring and interesting.
Yeah, we'll get a download of the comments, but I've also copied all the questions out